The millionaire's son married an ugly woman against his father's will. However, when the bride took off her veil, everyone was left speechless. The Sullivan mansion stood like a fortress of glass and limestone on the Upper East Side, its windows glittering in the morning sun, like the ambitions of the man who built it. Richard Sullivan's office occupied the entire top floor, offering a panoramic view of Manhattan, a daily reminder of the empire he'd constructed from nothing but ruthless determination and strategic genius. At 58, Richard still cut an imposing figure. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his bespoke suit immaculate, his posture military straight as he reviewed the quarterly reports of Sullivan Pharmaceuticals. The company's best-selling drug, Neurovan, had exceeded projections again. Nearly 30 million Americans now depended on it for neurological stability, a conveniently vague term that had helped the FDA fast-track its approval 5 years ago. "Mr. Carter is on line 1, sir," his assistant's voice announced through the intercom. Richard allowed himself a thin smile. The timing couldn't be more perfect. "Thomas?" he greeted warmly. "I was just looking at Neurovan's numbers. Your daughter's wedding to my Jake will unite more than just our families." On the other end, Thomas Carter chuckled. "Madison's thrilled. Our telecommunications network paired with your pharmaceuticals will be unstoppable." Richard nodded, though no one could see him. "The date is still set for next spring." "Absolutely. Madison's already chosen her dress." "Excellent. Jake will be thrilled." The lie slipped out effortlessly. In truth, Richard hadn't even told his son about the arrangement yet. At 28, Jake was brilliant. Harvard Business School, innovative thinking, compassionate leadership, everything a father could want in an heir, everything except obedience. Richard ended the call and swiveled his chair to face the window. The Sullivan dynasty was at a crucial juncture, with the Carter telecommunications empire joined to his pharmaceutical kingdom. They could expand globally in ways his competitors couldn't imagine. All Jake had to do was play his part. Across town, in a crumbling elementary school in the Bronx, Jake Sullivan knelt beside a small desk where 8-year-old Miguel was struggling with fractions. "See, if you have 4 pieces of pizza and you eat one, what fraction is left?" Jake asked. Miguel's face scrunched in concentration. 3/4. "Exactly." Jake high-fived the boy. Around them, 24 children worked with other volunteer tutors. All employees of Sullivan Pharmaceuticals who had no idea their young VP was among them. Jake had been running this education initiative for nearly a year, using a shell foundation to fund it. If his father knew he was wasting time on charity rather than acquisition strategy, there would be hell to pay. As the session ended, Jake gathered his things, nodding goodbye to the school's principal. That's when he first noticed her, a woman in her late 20s standing by the door, long chestnut hair partially obscuring her face. She wore a flowing scarf that draped elegantly around her neck and across the lower half of her face. "Mr. Sullivan." Her voice was soft but clear. "I'm Natalie Brooks. I teach literature here." Jake felt an unexpected flutter in his chest. Despite the scarf concealing much of her face, her eyes were captivating, intelligent, intense, and a striking shade of green that reminded him of summer leaves. "Please, call me Jake." He extended his hand, which she took with noticeable hesitation. "Your tutoring program is making a real difference," she said. "But I'm curious, why does the heir to Sullivan Pharmaceuticals hide his involvement?" Jake stiffened. "How did you—" "Your photo was in Forbes last month," she said, a hint of amusement in her voice. "Though you dressed down well." Jake studied her, noticing now how she kept the scarf positioned to cover most of her face. Only her eyes remained fully visible. "My father has specific ideas about how a Sullivan should spend his time," he admitted. "This doesn't fit his vision." "And what is his vision for you?" "Perpetuating the Sullivan legacy, making billion-dollar deals, marrying strategically." Jake was surprised by his own candor with this stranger. Natalie tilted her head slightly. "And what's your vision for yourself?" The question caught him off guard. No one had asked him that in years. "I believe businesses have responsibilities beyond profit," he said finally. "But that's not exactly the Sullivan way. Hence the secret tutoring." She nodded, understanding. "Your students would be disappointed to lose you." Jake found himself drawn to her, not just to her partially hidden beauty, but to something in her manner, a quiet intensity, a mystery. "Would you have coffee with me sometime?" The words left his mouth before he could reconsider. She seemed startled, one hand unconsciously adjusting her scarf. I don't generally socialize much. Just coffee, he pressed gently. I'd like to hear more about your work here. After a pause that felt eternal, she nodded. Friday after classes, but not anywhere fancy. The Carter girl is perfect for you, Richard declared that evening, pouring himself a generous scotch in the mansion's wood-paneled study. Beautiful, intelligent, connected. The merger of our families will be front-page news. Jake sat stiffly on the leather sofa, his untouched drink sweating onto the coaster. You arranged my marriage without consulting me. I arranged an opportunity, Richard corrected, his tone hardening. The Carter telecommunications empire alongside Sullivan Pharmaceuticals. We'd be untouchable. I'm not a corporate asset to be leveraged, Dad. Richard's eyes narrowed. Everything in this world is an asset, son. People, relationships, emotions. They're all commodities to be traded for advancement. I taught you that. You tried, Jake muttered. Richard set down his glass with controlled precision. The engagement announcement runs next month. You'll meet Madison for dinner next week. Jake rose, his jaw tight. And if I refuse? His father's laugh was cold. You won't. You're a Sullivan, and Sullivans understand power. In his penthouse apartment that night, Jake stood on his balcony overlooking Central Park, his father's words echoing in his mind. The Sullivan legacy had been drilled into him since childhood. Ruthlessness disguised as ambition, manipulation masquerading as strategy. Yet his thoughts kept drifting to the mysterious teacher with hidden features and penetrating eyes. Natalie Brooks represented everything outside his predetermined path. Humanity, simplicity, purpose. He didn't yet know that she was hiding far more than facial scars. He couldn't imagine that behind her concealing scarf lay not disfigurement, but a beautiful face that would have been instantly recognizable to anyone in his father's circle just 5 years ago. And he certainly couldn't know that 8 months from this night, she would be standing beside him at an altar, preparing to unleash a truth that would shatter the Sullivan empire and reveal that everything, his father, his legacy, even his own identity, was built on elaborately constructed lies. In her modest one-bedroom apartment in Queens, Natalie Brooks carefully removed the scarf that had concealed her face all day. She stood before the bathroom mirror, studying her reflection. Not the reflection of a disfigured woman, but one of striking beauty, high cheekbones, a delicate nose, and full lips that formed a perfect Cupid's bow. Her skin was flawless, with no trace of the burns or scars she claimed to hide. He asked me out, she whispered to her reflection, conflicted emotions battling within her. 5 years ago, that face in the mirror had a different name, Alexandra Pierce, heiress to Pierce Pharmaceuticals, once the second largest pharmaceutical company in the country before its mysterious collapse. Alexandra turned away from the mirror and moved to a small safe hidden in her closet. Inside lay the only physical remnants of her former life, newspaper clippings about the Pierce family plane crash, medical records documenting surgeries she never actually had, and a flash drive containing damning evidence against Richard Sullivan. She hadn't needed reconstructive surgery after the crash. She'd needed to disappear. The memories came flooding back as they always did. The private jet cutting through clouds, her parents discussing a report they planned to submit to the FDA the following day. Her father, David Pierce, had discovered that Neurovin, Sullivan Pharmaceuticals' flagship drug, was causing severe liver damage in a statistically significant portion of patients. The cover-up had been elaborate, but David had irrefutable evidence. Once this report goes public, Sullivan is finished, her father had said confidently, 17 minutes later. The plane's left engine exploded. Alexandra still remembered the terrifying freefall, her mother's screams, her father's desperate attempt to shield her with his own body. The impact had killed both her parents instantly. She alone had survived, thrown clear of the main wreckage and found by rescuers hours later. The official investigation ruled it mechanical failure. Only Alexandra suspected otherwise. But a grieving 22-year-old's conspiracy theories were easily dismissed, especially when Richard Sullivan publicly expressed profound sorrow for his dear friends and respected competitors, while recovering in a private hospital paid for by her family's insurance. Alexandra overheard 2 nurses discussing how Sullivan Pharmaceuticals' stock had jumped 15 points after news of the Pierce tragedy. That same day, A manila envelope was delivered to her room with no return address. Inside were maintenance logs, communications between Sullivan executives, and offshore payments to the mechanic who had last serviced the Pierce family jet. The smoking gun was an email from Richard Sullivan himself. Ensure the problem is untraceable but definitive. The Pierce problem ends this week. A knock on her apartment door pulled Alexandra from her memories. She quickly resecured the scarf around her face before opening it. "You're late for our check-in," Mary Thompson said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. At 72, the Sullivan family's longtime housekeeper moved with surprising vigor, her shrewd eyes missing nothing as she surveyed the apartment. "I lost track of time," Alexandra replied. Mary had been the most unexpected ally in Alexandra's revenge plan. The older woman had worked for the Sullivans for over 40 years, first as Jake's nanny, then as the mansion's head housekeeper. When Alexandra had begun plotting her revenge 3 years ago, Mary had unexpectedly reached out through an anonymous email. "I knew your parents well," Mary had explained during their first clandestine meeting. "The Pierces and Sullivans were actually friends once, before Richard's ambition poisoned everything. I helped change your diapers when you visited the Sullivan home as a baby." "Why help me?" Alexandra had asked suspiciously. Mary's answer had been cryptic. "Let's just say I've witnessed Richard Sullivan's true nature for 40 years. Some debts must be paid." With Mary's help, Alexandra Pierce officially disappeared to Europe for specialized reconstructive surgery. Meanwhile, Natalie Brooks was created, complete with a teaching degree, references, and a carefully constructed background. Mary had used her connections to secure Natalie a position at the very school where Jake Sullivan ran his secret tutoring program. "So, he asked you out," Mary said now, sitting at Alexandra's small kitchen table. "This is moving faster than we anticipated." Alexandra paced the room. "It was unexpected. He's not what I thought he'd be. Meaning, he's kind, genuine, nothing like his father." Mary's expression hardened. "Don't be fooled. He's a Sullivan. The same blood runs through his veins." Alexandra removed her scarf completely, running her fingers through her long hair. "He seems to genuinely care about those children he tutors. He keeps it secret from his father. A rebellious phase. Nothing more. I've known that boy since birth. Richard's influence runs deep." Mary leaned forward. "Remember what's at stake. Your parents' justice. The thousands of people who died from Neurovans side effects while Richard buried the evidence." Alexandra nodded, steeling herself. This momentary doubt was just weakness. Jake Sullivan was a means to an end, her pathway into the Sullivan inner circle. His interest in her was perfect for her plans. "I'll have coffee with him," she decided. "Start building his trust." "Good," Mary approved. "But be careful. If Richard ever discovers who you really are." The threat didn't need completion. They both knew Richard Sullivan would stop at nothing to protect himself. After Mary left, Alexandra returned to her bathroom mirror, this time applying specialized makeup to create the illusion of scarring along her jawline and cheek. She had practiced this art for months, learning to create realistic-looking burn scars that would be visible at the edges of her scarf, enough to validate her story without being so grotesque as to repulse. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was creating fake scars to hide the fact that she had no real ones, wearing a mask to conceal not disfigurement, but perfect beauty. For Friday's coffee with Jake, she would allow just a glimpse, enough to cement his belief in her cover story, enough to trigger that instinctive pity she had seen flicker across his face when he noticed her scarf. She hated exploiting his compassion, but it was necessary. "For you, Dad," she whispered, touching the fake scar tissue along her jawline. "For Mom. For everyone Sullivan has hurt." In the distance, thunder rumbled, a spring storm approaching New York. Alexandra felt it mirrored the gathering storm of her own making. For 3 years, she had lived as Natalie, building her false identity, waiting for the perfect opportunity. Now, Jake Sullivan had handed it to her unwittingly. Their coffee date would be the first step in a carefully orchestrated plan that would culminate in the complete destruction of Richard Sullivan. She would gain Jake's trust, then his heart, then use that connection to access the inner sanctum of the Sullivan empire. What she didn't plan for, couldn't plan for, was how Jake's gentle smile would affect her, how his evident conflict with his father's values would complicate her straightforward narrative of the Sullivans as monsters, How the simple act of watching him help a struggling child with math would stir something inside her that had been dormant since the crash. Alexandra Pierce had died in that plane crash. In all the ways that mattered, Natalie Brooks was now real. A construct, yes, but one that had taken on its own life. As she put away her makeup and prepared for bed, she wondered momentarily which was the true mask, Natalie's scarred face or Alexandra's quest for vengeance. The coffee shop in the Bronx was everything the Sullivan corporate headquarters was not. Small, unpretentious, and filled with the aroma of freshly ground beans rather than ambition and anxiety. Jake arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a corner table away from the windows. He'd dressed down in jeans and a simple button-down shirt, his Patek Philippe watch traded for a nondescript Timex. He spotted Natalie the moment she walked in, despite the scarf artfully arranged to cover most of her face. She carried herself with an innate grace that caught the attention of several patrons. Today, the edges of what appeared to be scarring were visible along her jawline. "You came," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "I'm a man of my word," Jake replied, pushing a ceramic mug toward her. "I ordered you a chai latte. The owner mentioned it's your usual." Something flickered across her visible features. Surprise, perhaps discomfort at being known. "Don't worry," he added quickly. "I didn't run a background check or anything stalkerish. Just asked Rosa what you like." Natalie relaxed slightly. "Most people avoid asking about me directly. They prefer whispering behind my back. About the..." Jake gestured vaguely toward her scarf. "Car accident 5 years ago." She touched the edge of her scarf reflexively. "People find it easier to gossip than to ask." Jake nodded, feeling a surge of admiration for her straightforwardness. "I admire how you don't let it define you, teaching, changing lives. That's who you are, not whatever's under the scarf." Natalie's eyes widened slightly before she looked down at her latte. "That's unusually perceptive. I've had some practice recognizing masks," Jake said wryly. "In my world, they're just designer suits and corporate jargon instead of scarves." For the next hour, they talked about everything except themselves. Literature, the education system, New York's forgotten neighborhoods. Jake felt an unfamiliar lightness. The weight of the Sullivan name temporarily lifted. Natalie was brilliantly articulate. Her knowledge of literature profound, her insights about human nature occasionally startling in their accuracy. "You never answered my question," she said eventually. "About your vision for yourself, not your father's vision for you." Jake stared into his coffee. "I believe business can be ethical and profitable simultaneously. Radical concept in my family. And what would that look like? An ethical Sullivan Pharmaceuticals. Transparent drug trials, accessible pricing, actually putting patients before shareholders." He laughed without humor. "My father would sooner set the company headquarters on fire. Yet you stay," Natalie observed. "I stay because leaving would solve nothing. The company would continue exactly as before, just without the one person trying to nudge it towards something better." Jake leaned forward. "What about you? Teaching wasn't your original plan, was it?" Natalie tensed almost imperceptibly. "What makes you say that?" "The way you talk about literature. It's like you're translating passion into pedagogy, not the other way around." For a moment, she seemed to retreat behind an invisible wall. Then, carefully, "I was studying comparative literature at Columbia after the accident." Priorities shifted. It wasn't quite a lie. Alexandra had indeed studied literature alongside her business courses, preparing for a dual role in her family's company. "I'm sorry," Jake said gently. "Don't be. Sometimes the lives we don't choose teach us more than the ones we do." As they left the coffee shop, Jake suggested walking through a nearby park. To his surprise, Natalie agreed. The spring afternoon was crisp but pleasant, cherry blossoms adding splashes of pink to the urban landscape. "You know, you never asked," Natalie said suddenly. "Asked what?" "To see, everyone eventually asks." Jake stopped walking. "Your scars are your business. Friendship isn't conditional on viewing them." Beneath her scarf, Alexandra felt something shift. A tiny crack in the foundation of her resolve. This man wasn't just different from his father. He seemed almost the antithesis of everything the Sullivan name represented. But she knew better than to trust appearances. Hadn't Richard Sullivan himself publicly mourned her parents while privately celebrating their deaths? Later that evening, Jake entered the gleaming Sullivan Pharmaceuticals headquarters. changing from his casual clothes into the suit he kept in his office. He had a dinner meeting with the board, another opportunity for his father to parade him as the future of the company. His phone buzzed with a text from Natalie. "Thank you for today? It was unexpectedly nice." He smiled, typing back. "Same time next Friday?" Her response came quickly. "I'd like that. Something amusing, son." Richard Sullivan's voice cut through Jake's moment of private happiness. Jake pocketed his phone. "Just confirming a meeting, Dad." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't press. "The Carter girl is looking forward to dinner next week. Her father says she's already planning the engagement party." "I never agreed to this arrangement," Jake said quietly. "The Sullivan-Carter merger is worth billions. Your personal preferences are irrelevant." Jake felt a familiar suffocation, the weight of the Sullivan legacy pressing down. "What if I refuse?" Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then I'll be forced to reconsider your position both in this company and in my will. There are plenty of hungry cousins who'd gladly take your place." The threat hung in the air, colder than any outright anger would have been. "Now," Richard continued smoothly, "shall we join the board? I believe they're eager to hear about our expansion plans." In her apartment, Alexandra stared at her phone, reading Jake's text again. Each interaction with him complicated her plan. She'd expected a spoiled heir, perhaps with a thin veneer of charm masking Sullivan ruthlessness. Instead, she'd found someone genuinely at odds with his father's values, fighting a quiet battle from within. She pulled out her notebook, where she'd meticulously documented every step of her revenge plan. The coffee date had been Phase 1, establish contact. Phase 2 was supposed to be deepening the relationship, finding ways to access Sullivan information through Jake. Nowhere in the plan had she accounted for genuine connection. "It doesn't change anything," she told herself firmly. "He's still a Sullivan. He still benefits from his father's crimes." Her phone rang. Mary Thompson calling from the service entrance of the Sullivan mansion. "The board meeting just ended," Mary reported. "Richard is pushing hard for the Carter merger. He's threatening to disinherit Jake if he doesn't comply." Alexandra processed this information. Jake never mentioned an engagement, because he's fighting it. But Richard always wins these battles. Mary's voice lowered. "I've worked for that man for 40 years. He'll crush his own son before allowing him to derail his plans." After hanging up, Alexandra paced her small living room. The two worlds she was straddling suddenly colliding. Jake Sullivan lived in a gilded cage, much like she once had. Only his was built by the very man who had destroyed her family. For a moment, she felt an unwelcome surge of empathy for him. Then she hardened herself against it. Empathy was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when justice for her parents remained unserved. Still, as she prepared for bed, Alexandra found herself looking forward to next Friday, with the anticipation that had nothing to do with her revenge plot. For a few hours in that coffee shop, she had almost forgotten who she really was, and why she was in Jake Sullivan's life. The realization terrified her. 8 months had transformed everything. What began as coffee dates evolved into dinners, museum visits, and long walks through the city. For Jake, Natalie became a sanctuary from the suffocating pressure of the Sullivan empire. For Alexandra, the lines between her mission and her feelings blurred dangerously with each passing week. "You're falling in love with him," Mary accused during one of their clandestine meetings in Central Park. Alexandra shook her head, though without conviction. "I'm gaining his trust. That was always the plan." "Your plan didn't include him falling in love with you," Mary countered. "He's going to propose soon." "My sources are certain." Alexandra's heart skipped traitorously. "That would accelerate our timeline." "It would also require you to make decisions," Mary said sharply. "As his wife, you'd have unprecedented access to Sullivan documents and properties. But marriage isn't a game, Alexandra." "I'm aware," she replied coldly. Though in truth, she hadn't anticipated this complication. Becoming Jake Sullivan's wife would certainly position her perfectly to destroy Richard, but it would also irrevocably hurt Jake in the process. The thought troubled her more than it should have. The restaurant Jake chose for their special dinner was neither ostentatious nor touristy. A small Italian place in the West Village known for its authenticity rather than its celebrity sightings. Over 8 months, he'd learned that Natalie avoided places where she might be stared at, preferring intimate settings where her scarf-covered face wouldn't draw attention. "You're quiet tonight," she observed as they finished their pasta. Jake nodded, uncharacteristically nervous. "I've been thinking about us. About the future." Alexandra felt a knot forming in her stomach. This was it. The moment that would either cement her revenge or force her to confront the feelings she'd been denying. 8 months ago, I was drowning in expectations, living someone else's vision of my life, Jake continued. Then I met a literature teacher who hides her face but never her heart. He reached across the table for her hand. "You changed everything, Natalie. You made me brave enough to stand up to my father, to fight for what I believe in." Alexandra swallowed hard. "Jake, I've been fighting my father on the Carter engagement last week. I told him definitively it would never happen. He's threatened to remove me from the company, from his will, everything." "What did you do?" she asked, genuinely concerned. Jake smiled, a freedom in his expression she'd never seen before. "I told him to go ahead, that I'd rather build something meaningful from scratch than inherit an empire built on exploitation." "He must have been furious," Alexandra whispered, imagining Richard Sullivan's rage. "Apocalyptic," Jake confirmed. "But for the first time in my life I didn't care, because I know what I want now." He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, and Alexandra felt the world tilt on its axis. This wasn't supposed to happen so soon. She wasn't prepared for the storm of emotions roiling within her. "I know it's unconventional," Jake said softly. "I know we'd face opposition from every direction, but I love you, Natalie Brooks. Not despite your scars, but including them. They're part of what made you who you are, the woman I want to spend my life with." He opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant diamond ring. "Will you marry me?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither could fully comprehend. For Jake, it represented final liberation from his father's control. For Alexandra, it was both the perfect advancement of her revenge plot and a moral crisis she hadn't anticipated. "Your father will never accept me," she said, playing for time. "I don't need his acceptance. I need yours." Alexandra looked into Jake's earnest eyes, seeing nothing of Richard Sullivan's cold calculation in them. If she said yes, she would gain everything she needed to bring Richard down. If she said no, her entire plan would crumble, along with whatever genuine happiness she'd found these past months. "Yes," she whispered, the word carrying both truth and deception. "Yes, I'll marry you." As Jake slipped the ring onto her finger and leaned across the table to kiss what little of her face was visible above her scarf, Alexandra closed her eyes, wondering if she was sealing her vengeance or her doom. Richard Sullivan's study had always intimidated Jake. The dark wood paneling, leather-bound books, and imposing desk were designed to make visitors feel small. Today, however, Jake entered with a new confidence. "You wanted to see me?" he asked. Standing rather than taking a seat, Richard looked up from his computer, eyes cold. "Madison Carter called in tears this morning. She'd seen pictures of you dining with your teacher friend last night. Apparently, there was a rather significant piece of jewelry involved." "I was going to tell you myself," Jake said calmly. "Tell me what? That you're throwing away $1 billion merger for some disfigured nobody? That you're willing to destroy everything I've built? Her name is Natalie Brooks, and I'm going to marry her." Richard's face flushed with anger. "Have you completely lost your mind? Do you know what this will do to our stock prices? To our standing in the community?" "I know exactly what it will do," Jake replied. "It will show that a Sullivan can choose love over power, compassion over profit. Sentimentality," Richard spat. "You've always been soft, just like your mother. I should have corrected that weakness years ago. It's not weakness to recognize that there's more to life than the Sullivan legacy." Richard stood, rounding his desk with dangerous calm. "If you go through with this, you're finished. No position at the company, no inheritance, nothing but your trust fund, which I can't legally touch." "I expected nothing less," Jake said, surprised by how little the threat affected him. "You think you can build a life with this woman? That you can escape the Sullivan name? Everything you are exists because of me." "Not everything," Jake said quietly. "And there's nothing you can do to stop this wedding." Richard's laugh was cold and calculating. "We'll see about that." As Jake turned to leave, Richard called after him. "Who is she really?" "This teacher who's bewitched you. Have you ever even seen her face?" The question struck Jake like physical blows. "What are you implying?" "Only that people aren't always what they seem. especially those who hide behind convenient disguises. "Stay away from her," Jake warned, a protective instinct flaring within him. Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm simply concerned for my son. Wouldn't any father want to know who's marrying into the family?" After Jake left, Richard picked up his phone and dialed a private number. "I need everything on Natalie Brooks," he instructed. "Education records, medical history, family background if she's hiding anything. I want to know. If she has any skeletons, dig them up." In her apartment, Alexandra stared at the engagement ring on her finger, its diamond catching the afternoon light. Everything was unfolding exactly as planned, yet nothing felt as she had expected. Her phone rang. "Mary. Richard's hired investigators," Mary reported without preamble. "He's digging into Natalie Brooks' past." Alexandra had anticipated this. "The records will hold up to scrutiny. You made sure of that." "Surface investigation, yes. But Richard's not hiring amateurs. They'll keep digging until they find inconsistencies." Alexandra twisted the ring nervously. "How much time do we have?" "A few weeks, maybe less." Mary paused. "Are you sure you want to go through with this? Once you marry him, there's no going back." The question echoed Alexandra's own doubts. 8 months ago, Jake Sullivan had been nothing more than a means to an end. Now, he was becoming something far more complicated. "The wedding proceeds as planned," she said firmly, squashing her doubts. "Richard Sullivan will finally pay for what he did to my parents." But as she ended the call, Alexandra wondered which was the greater deception, the false identity she'd created, or her pretense that her feelings for Jake weren't genuine. The announcement of Jake Sullivan's engagement to Natalie Brooks exploded through New York society like a thunderclap. The New York Times announcement, deliberately sparse on details about the bride, spawned a hurricane of speculation. "They're saying she's a disfigured schoolteacher," Madison Carter hissed to her father over brunch at the plaza. "A nobody from Queens with some tragic backstory. It's humiliating." Thomas Carter patted his daughter's hand. "Richard assures me he's handling it. This infatuation will pass." Across town, in a sleek office tower, Richard Sullivan sat across from Frank Donovan, a former FBI agent who'd built a lucrative career in private investigation. "What have you found?" Richard demanded. Donovan slid a thin folder across the desk. On paper, Natalie Brooks is exactly what she appears. Born in Ohio, bachelor's degree from Ohio State, master's from NYU, car accident 5 years ago resulting in facial injuries, moved to New York for specialized treatment. Started teaching 3 years ago. And beneath the paper, that's where it gets interesting. Her medical records are comprehensive, but too clean. The hospital exists, the doctors exist. But when I spoke with staff there, nobody remembered a patient with her extensive injuries. Richard leaned forward. "What else?" "Her apartment lease started 3 years ago, matching when she began teaching. But I can't find any record of where she lived between the accident and moving to Queens. 5 years ago, she essentially appeared out of nowhere." "Could she be after my money?" Donovan shrugged. "Possible, but unlikely. She lives modestly. No suspicious financial transactions. She seems genuinely dedicated to teaching." Richard drummed his fingers on the folder. "Keep digging. Everyone has secrets. Find hers." "June wedding at the St. Thomas Church," Jake announced, scrolling through his phone calendar as he and Natalie sat in her apartment. "Small reception at the Botanical Garden after. Nothing ostentatious." Alexandra nodded, relieved he wasn't pushing for some gaudy Sullivan spectacle. "Your father won't approve." "My father hasn't approved of anything I've done since I learned to walk," Jake replied with a wry smile. "But he'll show up. Appearances matter more than anything to him." Alexandra's stomach tightened. Richard Sullivan would indeed attend, and within minutes of her revealing her true identity at that wedding, his carefully constructed world would collapse. "Do you ever think about your parents?" she asked suddenly. "What they would think of us?" Jake's expression softened. "My mother died when I was 7. I barely remember her. Just a gentle voice and the smell of jasmine. As for my father, he's made his feelings abundantly clear. What was she like, your mother? Kind, always reading to me. My father says I inherited her soft heart like it's a defect." He squeezed Natalie's hand. "What about yours?" Alexandra swallowed hard. This wasn't fabricated backstory. This was her actual pain. They died in an accident too. They were brilliant, ethical, everything I aspired to be. They'd be proud of you, Jake said gently, building a new life after your accident, dedicating yourself to teaching. If only he knew how far from the truth that was. She wasn't building anything. She was methodically planning destruction. 2 weeks before the wedding, Mary Thompson slipped into Alexandra's apartment, her face drawn with worry. "Richard's investigators are getting too close," she whispered, though they were alone. "They've been questioning staff at the hospital where Natalie Brooks was supposedly treated." Alexandra paced her small living room. "The records are solid. You said so yourself. Records can be verified. People can be questioned. It's only a matter of time before someone realizes Natalie Brooks didn't exist until 3 years ago. Then we accelerate the plan," Alexandra decided. "I have everything I need to expose Richard at the wedding. The sabotage evidence, witness statements from former Sullivan employees about the Neurovan cover-up, even the maintenance worker who tampered with my parents' plane. I found him living in Arizona under a new name." Mary shook her head. "It's too risky. Richard suspects something. He's increased security around all Sullivan properties. He's having background checks run on every wedding guest." "Let him," Alexandra said defiantly. "By the time he discovers anything concrete, I'll be standing at that altar, ready to tear his world apart." Mary studied her with concern. "And what about Jake? Are you prepared to destroy him too?" The question hit Alexandra like a physical blow. "Jake isn't his father. He'll understand eventually." "You're lying to yourself," Mary said softly. "Do you really believe he'll forgive you for using him? For making a mockery of his love?" Alexandra turned away, unable to face the truth in Mary's words. "This isn't about Jake. It's about justice for my parents and everyone else the Sullivans have harmed. Justice and vengeance aren't the same thing." "Child, they are when the legal system has failed," Alexandra retorted. "Richard Sullivan literally got away with murder. He's destroyed countless lives with his greed." Mary sighed heavily. "Just be certain you can live with the consequences. All of them." After Mary left, Alexandra removed her scarf and makeup, washing away Natalie Brooks. Standing barefaced before her bathroom mirror, she confronted her true reflection. Not the scarred teacher, but the vengeful daughter of David and Diana Pierce. "I'm doing this for you," she whispered to her parents' memory. "For everyone he's hurt." But the face in the mirror looked doubtful. At the Sullivan mansion, Jake stood his ground as Richard berated him about the wedding arrangements. "A small ceremony at your social level?" Richard was incredulous. "People expect spectacle from a Sullivan wedding. The guest list you've provided is barely 100 people." "That's intentional," Jake replied calmly. "Natalie gets anxious in crowds. She's self-conscious about her scars." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Scars you've never actually seen. That's between Natalie and me. Is it? Because I find it curious that none of her colleagues can describe these supposedly horrific injuries. She's always perfectly covered in public." Jake felt a flicker of unease, quickly suppressed. "She's private. It's one of the things I respect about her. Privacy is one thing, secrecy is another." Richard pulled out a folder similar to the one Donovan had presented him. "Did you know there's no record of where she lived for 2 years after her accident? That none of the specialists who supposedly treated her recall a patient matching her description?" Jake snatched the folder, anger rising. "You had her investigated. What gives you the right?" "I'm protecting my son and my family name," Richard said unapologetically. "Something about this woman doesn't add up." "Stay out of my life," Jake warned, throwing the folder onto Richard's desk. "The wedding happens in 2 weeks. You can either support me or continue this. Whatever this is, but you won't change my mind." As Jake stormed out, Richard called after him. "Ask to see her face, son. See what happens." The suggestion lingered like poison as Jake drove to Natalie's apartment. In 8 months, he'd never pressured her about her scars, respecting her comfort level and privacy, but his father's insinuations planted a seed of doubt he couldn't quite shake. Natalie answered the door in her customary scarf, her eyes immediately registering his troubled expression. "What's wrong?" Jake hesitated. "My father had you investigated." Alexandra felt ice spread through her veins, but kept her expression neutral. "I'm not surprised. Did he find anything interesting?" "Just gaps, things that didn't quite make sense to him." Jake ran a hand through his hair. "It's nothing. He's desperate to sabotage us." You seem bothered, though. Jake met her eyes directly. He suggested I ask to see your face. To test you, I guess. The moment hung between them, charged with unspoken tension. This was the precipice. If Jake pushed, if he demanded to see beneath her scarf now, Alexandra's entire plan would unravel. Do you want to? She asked softly. Jake took her hands in his. I want you to trust me enough to show me when you're ready. Not before, not because my father's planted doubts. Alexandra fought back unexpected tears. His trust was a knife to her conscience. After the wedding, she promised. When we exchange vows, I'll remove the veil completely. No more hiding. It wasn't a lie. She would indeed remove her veil at the wedding. And with it, every other deception she'd constructed. I can wait, Jake said, pulling her close. Nothing my father says could change how I feel about you. Alexandra closed her eyes, resting against his chest, wondering if he would still feel that way 2 weeks from now, when Natalie Brooks ceased to exist and Alexandra Pierce rose from the ashes to destroy his father. The night before her wedding, Alexandra stood alone in her apartment, surrounded by the remnants of Natalie Brooks's life. Tomorrow, this carefully constructed identity would shatter like glass. Tomorrow, Alexandra Pierce would return to the world in spectacular fashion, and Richard Sullivan would finally face justice. So why did she feel like she was about to commit a terrible crime? Her wedding dress hung on the closet door, elegant, understated, with a custom veil that would completely obscure her face during the ceremony. Not the traditional whisper of tulle, but an opaque shield behind which she would make her final preparations. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. It's customary for the bride to have company the night before her wedding, Mary said, entering with a bottle of champagne. Even a bride with ulterior motives. Alexandra managed a weak smile. Is everything ready for tomorrow? Mary nodded, pouring 2 glasses. The documentation is in place. The witnesses are prepared to come forward. The evidence against Richard has been duplicated and secured with 3 separate attorneys. She handed Alexandra a glass. No matter what happens tomorrow, Richard Sullivan will face criminal charges for what he did to your parents. And Jake, Alexandra whispered. What will happen to him? Mary's expression softened with concern. That depends largely on you, doesn't it? On what you say to him after the truth comes out. Alexandra turned away, unable to face the question hovering between them. Did she love Jake Sullivan enough to salvage something from the wreckage she was about to create? I've spent 3 years planning this revenge, she said instead. I can't falter now. Mary sipped her champagne thoughtfully. There's something you should know before tomorrow. Something I've never told you about the Sullivans. Alexandra tensed. What is it? Not tonight? Mary decided, setting down her glass. You need rest before tomorrow. We can discuss it after the ceremony, when everything is done. Mary, it's nothing that changes what Richard did, Mary assured her. Just context that might be important afterward. Alexandra wanted to press further, but exhaustion was overtaking her. The weight of tomorrow's revelation. The culmination of years of planning, pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Try to sleep, Mary advised, gathering her purse. Tomorrow will be eventful. After Mary left, Alexandra removed her scarf and the makeup that created her fake scars. She stared at her true face in the mirror, a face that only Mary had seen these past 3 years. One more day, she told her reflection. One more day as Natalie Brooks. Across town, in his penthouse apartment, Jake Sullivan stood on his balcony, watching the city lights shimmer against the night sky. His phone buzzed. Another message from his father. We need to talk before tomorrow. Crucial information about Natalie. Jake deleted it without responding, as he had the previous 5 messages. Whatever desperate tactics his father had planned, Jake wanted no part of them. His phone rang, Madison Carter's name flashing on the screen. He almost declined the call, then reconsidered. She deserved at least the courtesy of a conversation. Madison, he answered neutrally. Don't marry her, Jake. Her voice was strained, lacking its usual confidence. Your father showed me the investigation files. Something isn't right about her. Jake sighed. My father is manipulating you, just like he tries to manipulate everyone. No, listen to me. I had my own people look into her background. The accident she claims changed her life. The reports are inconsistent. The medical records exist. but there's no proof she was actually treated at those facilities. I'm not discussing this. Jake, please, Madison's voice cracked. I know we were an arrangement. Not a love match, but I care enough about you to warn you. This woman is hiding something significant, something beyond facial scars. The certainty in Madison's voice gave Jake pause. What exactly are you suggesting? I don't know, she admitted. But please, before you say your vows tomorrow, ask yourself why someone would create such an elaborate deception. What could be worth hiding behind literal and figurative veils? After ending the call, Jake poured himself a scotch, Madison's words echoing uncomfortably. He'd been so certain his father's suspicions were just desperate attempts to maintain control, but Madison had no reason to lie. His phone rang again. Richard Sullivan. Against his better judgment, Jake answered, "It's late, Dad. Have you asked yourself why she insists on complete facial covering in public? Why none of her supposed medical providers remember treating her? Why there's a 2-year gap in her documented existence after her accident?" Jake gripped the phone tighter. "I trust her." "Then you're a fool," Richard said bluntly. "My investigators finally found something concrete. The real Natalie Brooks died 15 years ago at age 8. Whoever you're marrying tomorrow, it isn't Natalie Brooks." A cold sensation spread through Jake's chest. "You're lying. I'm sending you the death certificate now. Ohio Public Records, check for yourself." Jake's phone pinged with an incoming file. His hand trembled slightly as he opened it. A scanned death certificate for Natalie Elizabeth Brooks, aged 8, from Columbus, Ohio, heart failure. "This doesn't prove anything," Jake insisted, though doubt had taken root. "It could be someone with the same name. The birth date matches exactly with your fiancé's claimed birth date," Richard countered. "It's identity theft, plain and simple. Why would she—" "That's what you need to find out, son, before you legally bind yourself to someone who doesn't even exist." After his father hung up, Jake stared at the death certificate on his phone screen, possibilities cycling through his mind. Could Natalie have stolen an identity to escape an abusive situation? To hide from someone dangerous? Or was there something more sinister at work? He dialed Natalie's number, unsure what he would even say. The call went straight to voicemail. "It's me," he said after the beep. I just wanted to hear your voice before tomorrow. I love you." He ended the call, the words feeling both true and suddenly precarious. In her apartment, Alexandra listened to Jake's message, her phone set to do not disturb mode for all callers except him. The naked vulnerability in his voice nearly broke her resolve. She almost called him back, almost confessed everything, almost abandoned 3 years of planning and the justice her parents deserved. Almost. Instead, she sent a text. "Can't wait to be your wife tomorrow. Everything will finally be clear." It wasn't a lie. Tomorrow, everything would indeed become devastatingly clear. Alexandra turned back to her preparations. On her kitchen table lay the final components of her revenge: a USB drive containing evidence of Sullivan Pharmaceuticals' criminal negligence with Neurovan, testimony from the mechanic who had sabotaged her parents' plane, and financial records showing money transfers from Sullivan's offshore accounts. Beside these lay an envelope containing the last thing Richard Sullivan would expect: her mother's locket, recovered from the crash site, containing photos of Alexandra as a child alongside her parents. It would be the final, irrefutable proof of her identity. As midnight approached, Alexandra carefully applied her fake scar makeup one last time, then covered it with her scarf. Natalie Brooks' final appearance. She tried to focus on tomorrow's vindication, the moment when Richard Sullivan would realize who she really was, when justice would finally be served for her parents and all of Richard's other victims. Instead, her mind fixated on Jake's face. How would he look at her when he realized everything between them had been built on deception? Would he see past her lies to the genuine feelings that had developed despite her intentions? Alexandra curled up on her bed, still fully dressed, too anxious to change or even attempt sleep. Tomorrow would bring the culmination of years of planning and pain. Tomorrow, Alexandra Pierce would rise from the ashes of her parents' murder to bring down their killer, but as she finally drifted into restless sleep, it wasn't thoughts of vengeance that filled her mind, but the memory of Jake's smile, his kindness, his unfailing belief in her, even a her that didn't truly exist. St. Thomas Church stood majestic against the clear June sky, its Gothic architecture a stark contrast to the modern skyscrapers surrounding it. Inside, flowers adorned every pew, white roses and lilies creating an atmosphere of ethereal elegance. Despite Jake's desire for a small ceremony, the church was filled with New York's elite. The Sullivan name had drawn them like moths to flame, many secretly hoping to witness a scandal rather than a celebration. In a small anteroom, Jake adjusted his bow tie. His stomach knotted with a mixture of anticipation and lingering doubt. His father's revelations about Natalie's identity had kept him awake most of the night, yet he'd made his decision. He would trust the woman he loved until she gave him reason not to. "Still time to back out," Richard Sullivan remarked, entering the room in an impeccable tuxedo. Jake met his father's gaze in the mirror. "I didn't think you'd come. And miss my only son's wedding. What would people say?" Richard's smile was brittle. "Did you look into what I sent you?" "I did. And..." Jake turned to face his father directly. "And I'm still getting married today." Richard's expression hardened. "You're making a catastrophic mistake." "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." Jake moved toward the door. "I should take my place at the altar." Richard grabbed his arm. "Jake, listen to me. This woman, whoever she really is, she's hiding something substantial. My investigators found..." "I don't want to hear it," Jake interrupted, pulling away. "Whatever game you're playing ends now." As Jake left the room, Richard pulled out his phone, sending a terse text to Frank Donovan, who was positioned discreetly among the wedding guests. "Be ready to move when I signal." In the bridal suite, Alexandra sat perfectly still as the makeup artist applied the final touches to her exposed skin. The elaborate veil, opaque enough to completely conceal her face, lay ready on a nearby table. "I've never done a bride who wanted to be so covered," the makeup artist commented. "Usually it's all about highlighting features, not hiding them." Alexandra smiled tightly. "I have my reasons." "Well, it's certainly unique," the woman continued, applying a bit more concealer to Alexandra's fake scars. "Though I could do wonders with those scars if you'd let me try a different approach. There are techniques that..." "This is perfect, thank you," Alexandra interrupted, eager to be alone with her thoughts. After the makeup artist left, Mary entered, carrying the bridal bouquet. Her expression was grave. "Richard's investigators discovered the real Natalie Brooks died as a child," she said without preamble. "He knows you're using a false identity." Alexandra's heart raced. "Does he know who I really am?" "Not yet, but he has people at the ceremony. He's planning something." "It doesn't matter," Alexandra said firmly. "In less than an hour, I'll reveal everything myself." Mary touched her arm gently. "Are you absolutely certain about this path? Once you cross this bridge, there's no return." For a moment, Alexandra hesitated. The weight of her impending actions pressed down on her. Years of planning, of living as someone else, had culminated in this moment. Yet now that it had arrived, she felt none of the vindication she'd anticipated. "I have to do this," she said, more to convince herself than Mary. "For my parents, for justice." Mary handed her the veil. "Then it's time." The heavy material settled over Alexandra's face, transforming her into a ghost bride, faceless, mysterious, separated from the world by a barrier of her own creation. The wedding march began, its familiar notes filling the cathedral. Heads turned as the bride appeared at the entrance, a spectral figure in white, her face completely obscured by the unusual veil. Whispers rippled through the congregation. "Can't even show her face on her wedding day!" "I heard the scars are horrific." Poor Jake, settling for damaged goods. Alexandra heard none of it. Her focus was entirely on the altar ahead, and the moment of revelation that would follow the ceremony. Jake watched her approach, a mixture of emotions crossing his face. Love, certainly, but also something else. A wariness that hadn't been there before. Had his father's suspicions taken root? After all, as she reached him, Jake took her hands in his, through the veil. Their eyes met, his questioning, hers resolute. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, his voice echoing through the cathedral. "We are gathered here today." The ceremony proceeded in a dreamlike state for Alexandra. She spoke her responses mechanically, her mind focused on what would come after, the moment when she would lift her veil not to seal her marriage, but to unleash her revenge. "If anyone can show just cause why this couple cannot lawfully be joined together in matrimony," the minister intoned, Let them speak now or forever hold their peace. A tense silence fell over the congregation. Richard Sullivan shifted in his front row seat, but remained silent. His moment would come later. Do you, Jake Sullivan, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Jake hesitated almost imperceptibly before answering. I do. And do you, Natalie Brooks, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Alexandra drew a deep breath. I do. The rings, please. As they exchanged rings, Alexandra felt the weight of the gold band on her finger, a symbol of commitment that, for her, was built entirely on deception. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife, the minister declared. You may kiss the bride. The moment had arrived. Jake reached for her veil, his movements slow, almost hesitant. Wait, Alexandra said, her voice stronger than she expected. Before you lift this veil, there's something everyone here needs to know. A confused murmur spread through the congregation. Jake froze, his expression a mixture of concern and dawning realization that something was very wrong. Natalie, what? My name isn't Natalie Brooks. Her voice carried throughout the suddenly silent church. That identity was a creation, a means to an end. With steady hands, she lifted the veil herself, revealing not the scarred face everyone expected, but one of striking, unmarred beauty. Gasps echoed through the cathedral. My name is Alexandra Pierce, she announced, her gaze fixed on Richard Sullivan, whose face had drained of all color, daughter of David and Diana Pierce, who died in a plane crash 5 years ago, a crash that was no accident. The silence in the church was absolute, broken only by Richard Sullivan's chair scraping back as he stood. This is outrageous, he began, but Alexandra cut him off. The plane carrying my parents was sabotaged, she continued, her voice ringing with years of suppressed rage. Sabotaged on the orders of Richard Sullivan to prevent them from revealing that his company's best-selling drug, Neurovan, was causing fatal liver damage, a fact they had discovered and were about to report to the FDA. Jake stared at her, his expression transforming from confusion to horror. Alexandra Pierce, he whispered. The family that your father destroyed, she finished for him. I survived the crash. I've spent the last 3 years gathering evidence, creating the identity of Natalie Brooks, working my way into position to expose the truth. She turned to face the stunned congregation. I have documentation proving the sabotage, testimony from the mechanic who was paid to tamper with the plane, financial records of offshore payments, everything needed to bring Richard Sullivan to justice. Richard stepped into the aisle, his face contorted with fury. This woman is clearly delusional. Security, remove her immediately. But before anyone could move, Mary Thompson rose from her seat, her voice cutting through the chaos. Everything she says is true. I've worked in the Sullivan household for 40 years. I've witnessed Richard's crimes firsthand, helped cover many of them myself. But not this time. The church erupted in shocked conversations. Journalists present for the society wedding were already typing frantically on their phones. Security personnel looked uncertainly between Richard and Jake, unsure whose orders to follow. Alexandra turned back to Jake, whose face had become a mask of shock and betrayal. I never meant to fall in love with you, she said softly, for his ears alone. That wasn't part of the plan. Was any of it real? He asked, his voice barely audible. Before she could answer, Richard Sullivan pushed his way to the altar, rage making him reckless. You think you can destroy me with these fabrications? I'll bury you so deep no one will remember your name. Jake stepped between his father and Alexandra. Is it true? He demanded. Did you have her parents killed? Richard's eyes darted between his son and the congregation. Don't be ridiculous. This woman has clearly orchestrated an elaborate con. She's after the Sullivan fortune, nothing more. Answer me, Jake insisted. Did you sabotage the Pierce family's plane? The look that passed between father and son contained decades of complicated history. For a moment, it seemed Richard might confess, might finally reveal his true nature to the son he'd tried so hard to mold in his image. Instead, he turned to the congregation with a practiced, dismissive smile. My son has obviously been deceived by a woman with a talent for manipulation, a disappointing end to what should have been a joyous occasion. But as Richard attempted to reclaim control of the situation, Mary Thompson stepped forward, carrying a small wooden box. "There's one more truth that needs to be told today," she announced, her voice cutting through the chaos. "One final secret that changes everything." Mary Thompson stood at the center of the chaos, the small wooden box clutched in her weathered hands. The church had fallen into an uneasy silence, the kind that comes before a devastating storm. "I've served the Sullivan family for over 40 years," Mary said, her voice wavering slightly but growing stronger with each word. "I've kept their secrets, cleaned up their messes, and watched the corruption eat away at what was once a good man." Richard's face contorted with rage. "Mary, whatever you think you're doing, silence," she commanded with surprising authority. "You've done enough damage." Mary turned to Jake, her expression softening. "My boy, what I'm about to tell you will change everything you believe about yourself." Jake stood frozen between his father and Alexandra, his world already crumbling. "What are you talking about?" Mary approached him slowly, opening the wooden box. Inside lay a yellowed envelope and a faded photograph. "Before you were born, your mother had a brief relationship with David Pierce." A collective gasp swept through the congregation. Alexandra's eyes widened in horrified realization. "This is absurd," Richard growled. "Catherine would never." "It was before your engagement was announced," Mary continued, undeterred. "A few months later, she discovered she was pregnant. By then, she was already committed to you, Richard. You agreed to raise the child as your own, never revealing the truth." Jake staggered backward, grabbing the altar rail for support. "What are you saying?" Mary handed him the photograph. In it, a young David Pierce stood beside Jake's mother, their expressions intimate and loving. "David Pierce was your biological father, Jake," Mary said softly. "The man Richard had killed was your real father." The revelation landed like a physical blow. Jake's knees buckled as the implications cascaded through his mind. Alexandra's face had drained of all color. "No," she whispered. "That would mean you and Jake are half-siblings," Mary confirmed, her expression grave. "You share a father." The church erupted again, reporters frantically documenting every word, guests muttering in scandalized tones. Richard Sullivan stood immobilized, his carefully constructed world disintegrating around him. Alexandra felt the room spinning. The man she'd fallen in love with, the man she'd just married, was her half-brother. The revenge she'd meticulously planned had led her not to justice, but to an unspeakable taboo. "You're lying," Jake accused Mary, his voice breaking. "This is another manipulation. The letter in this box contains a confession from your mother," Mary replied, "written before she died, entrusted to me to give you when the time was right." "And you decided our wedding day was the right time?" Alexandra demanded, anger temporarily overriding her shock. Mary met her gaze steadily. "I decided the truth needed to be revealed before you destroyed each other." Jake unfolded the letter with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the faded handwriting. His expression shifted from disbelief to devastation as he read his mother's words, confirming everything Mary had claimed. "No," he whispered, letting the letter fall to the ground. "This can't be true." Richard Sullivan, seeing his son's distress, finally found his voice. "Jake, whatever this letter says, you are my son. I raised you. I shaped you. Pierce was nothing. You murdered my father," Jake said, his voice deadly quiet. "You killed a man knowing he was my biological father." "I didn't know for certain," Richard began, but the lie was transparent. "Of course you knew," Mary interjected. "Why else would you keep the photo Catherine left? Why else would you obsessively track David's career, his family? Why else would you insist Jake never interact with the Pierces, even at industry events?" Alexandra watched the exchange in numb horror, her elaborate revenge plan now a grotesque mockery. She had fallen in love with her own half-brother, had married him. The revelation was too monstrous to process. "You wanted the Pierce bloodline under your control," Mary continued, addressing Richard. "You couldn't bear that your son carried another man's DNA, especially your rival's. So you claimed him, shaped him, tried to erase every trace of David in him." Richard's face had gone from white to purple with rage. "You treacherous old woman, after everything I've done for you. You've done nothing but corrupt everything you touch," Mary shot back. "You killed David and Diana to protect your profits, never caring that you were robbing your own son of his biological father." Jake backed away from both Richard and Alexandra, his expression haunted. This whole time, everything was a lie. His gaze landed on Alexandra. What we felt for each other. We didn't know, she whispered, though the words offered little comfort. I had no idea. A commotion at the church entrance drew everyone's attention. Police officers were making their way down the aisle. Led by a stern-faced detective, Richard Sullivan, the detective announced, "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, corporate fraud, and obstruction of justice." Richard's face contorted with disbelief. "This is preposterous. I'm Richard Sullivan. Your name doesn't grant you immunity," the detective replied coolly. "We've received substantial evidence implicating you in the deaths of David and Diana Pierce, as well as in covering up critical safety data related to Neurovan." As the officers approached, Richard suddenly clutched at his chest, his face contorting in pain. "Can't breathe," he gasped, collapsing to his knees on the church's marble floor. "Dad?" Jake rushed to his side, instinct overriding everything else. "Call an ambulance!" someone shouted as Richard fell backward, his breathing ragged. Alexandra stood frozen, watching as her carefully orchestrated revenge was superseded by what appeared to be a massive heart attack. Medical professionals among the guests rushed forward, beginning CPR as Richard's lips turned blue. In the midst of the chaos, Richard grabbed Jake's hand with surprising strength. "I did it. For you," he wheezed. "Everything. For you. Not my blood, but still, my son." His eyes shifted to Alexandra, recognition and hatred mingling in his gaze. "You, so like your father, same, arrogance." Then his eyes rolled back, his grip on Jake's hand going slack. "We're losing him," a doctor shouted, continuing chest compressions. Alexandra watched numbly as paramedics arrived, taking over with defibrillators and emergency medication. The wedding guest had been ushered outside, but she remained rooted to the spot, unable to process the catastrophic unraveling of everything she'd planned. Jake looked up from his father's prone form, his eyes meeting Alexandra's across the church. In that gaze was a universe of betrayal, confusion, and revulsion, not just at her deception, but at the biological truth that had turned their love into something forbidden. "Time of death, 11:42 a.m., a paramedic announced quietly, stepping back from Richard's still form. A strangled sob escaped Jake's throat, despite everything Richard had done. He had been the only father Jake had ever known. As police officers respectfully gave Jake space to grieve, Detective Hansen approached Alexandra. "Ms. Pierce, we'll need your statement regarding the evidence you've collected against Mr. Sullivan." Alexandra nodded mechanically, but her attention remained fixed on Jake, her husband. Her half-brother, the unintended casualty of her revenge. The wedding that was supposed to culminate in justice had instead ended with death, and the revelation of a truth too terrible to bear. As paramedics covered Richard Sullivan's body with a sheet, Alexandra realized that her years of plotting had led not to the clean vengeance she'd imagined, but to a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. The cathedral, so recently adorned for celebration, now stood as a mausoleum to shattered lives and irrevocable revelations. The wedding guests who had come expecting high society drama had witnessed something far more devastating, the complete destruction of two intertwined dynasties, brought down not by corporate warfare, but by secrets, lies, and the unintended consequences of vengeance. 6 months after the catastrophic wedding, Jake Sullivan stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, watching Snowblanket Central Park. Winter had descended on New York, turning the city into a monochrome landscape that matched his emotional state. Richard Sullivan's funeral had been a media circus, with reporters speculating wildly about the scandalous revelations that had preceded his death. The subsequent investigations into Sullivan Pharmaceuticals had uncovered decades of corruption, data falsification, and criminal negligence that extended far beyond the Neurovan cover-up. Jake had stepped up as CEO despite his initial impulse to walk away from everything bearing the Sullivan name. The company's 15,000 employees deserved better than to suffer for his father's crimes. His phone buzzed with a text from his attorney. "DNA results are in. Meeting in 30. Jake's heart rate quickened. For 6 months, he'd avoided all contact with Alexandra, processing his anger and confusion in isolation. The wedding had been legally annulled within days. The entirety of their relationship rendered not just a deception, but a biological taboo by Mary's revelation. Yet doubt had lingered in Jake's mind. Something about Mary's dramatic revelation had seemed theatrical, too convenient. After weeks of brooding, he'd authorized a comprehensive investigation, not just into Alexandra's claims about his father, which had proven devastatingly accurate, but into Mary's claim about his own paternity. Across town, in a modest hotel suite that had been her home since the wedding, Alexandra sat opposite Dr. Neil Winters, one of the country's foremost geneticists. "You're absolutely certain?" she asked for the third time, struggling to process his words. Dr. Winters nodded patiently. "The genetic markers are conclusive. Miss Pierce, there is zero chance that you and Jake Sullivan share a biological father. You are definitively not related by blood." Alexandra pressed a hand to her mouth, emotions too complex to name washing over her. But Mary Thompson showed documentation. A letter from Jake's mother. A photograph. Documentation can be falsified. Dr. Andy Winters replied gently. "DNA cannot. Science doesn't lie, Mrs. Pierce. Whatever Ms. Thompson's motivations were for claiming you and Mr. Sullivan are siblings, biological reality contradicts her entirely." After the geneticist left, Alexandra sat in stunned silence, trying to make sense of this new revelation. If Mary had lied about Jake's paternity, what else had she lied about, and why? Her phone rang. Jake's attorney requesting a meeting. Mary Thompson's apartment in Queens was modest but comfortable, paid for by decades of Sullivan family's salary. At 72, she had expected to live out her retirement in peace. The pounding on her door suggested otherwise. "NYPD, open up, Ms. Thompson." Mary smoothed her cardigan and opened the door calmly. "Is there a problem, officers?" Detective Hansen stepped forward. "Mary Thompson, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and conspiracy related to the Sullivan-Pierce case." As they handcuffed her, Mary remained eerily composed. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out." The law offices of Geller and Associates occupied the 42nd floor of a sleek Manhattan high-rise. Jake arrived first, waiting tensely in the conference room. When Alexandra entered, it was their first face-to-face meeting since the wedding. She looked different, her hair shorter, her posture less guarded, without the scarf and fake scars. She was strikingly beautiful, yet Jake barely recognized the woman he'd thought he knew. "Thank you for coming," he said formally. "Your lawyer didn't give me much choice," she replied, taking a seat across from him rather than beside him. Richard's death and the subsequent investigations had confirmed everything Alexandra had claimed about the plane's sabotage and Neuroven cover-up. Richard Sullivan had indeed ordered the murder of her parents. That validation had brought Alexandra no joy, only a hollow emptiness where her quest for vengeance had once burned. Jake's attorney entered, followed by Dr. Winters and Detective Hansen. "Miss Pierce, Mr. Sullivan," the detective began. "We've uncovered significant evidence that Mary Thompson deliberately fabricated the claim that you are half-siblings." Alexandra tensed. "Why would she do that?" "We were hoping you might have insight," Hansen replied. "She's refusing to explain her motivations." Jake leaned forward. "What evidence do you have besides the DNA results?" Dr. Winters placed a folder on the table. "We've verified through multiple testing methods that you share no close biological relationship whatsoever. You have different blood types, different genetic markers. There's zero possibility that you share a father. Additionally," Hansen continued, "forensic analysis of the letter supposedly written by Jake's mother shows it was actually written approximately 3 years ago, not before her death as Mary claimed. The ink and paper are contemporary, not 20-plus years old. And the photograph," Alexandra asked, "digitally manipulated. Well done, but detectable under analysis. David Pierce and Catherine Sullivan were inserted into the same frame, but they were never actually photographed together." Jake rubbed his temples, processing this information. "So Mary created an elaborate lie to make us believe we were siblings. The question is why?" "We have a theory," Hansen said carefully. "Mary Thompson had a romantic relationship with Richard Sullivan spanning at least 30 years. This revelation stunned both Jake and Alexandra. "That's impossible," Jake said. "My father was devoted to my mother's memory. He never remarried after she died. He didn't remarry, but he maintained a relationship with Mary. We found extensive correspondence. gifts, even a property purchased jointly in the Catskills. Hansen slid several photographs across the table. Richard and Mary together at the mountain property, looking unmistakably intimate. Mary was in love with your father, Hansen continued. Based on our interviews with household staff, she believed that after your mother died, Richard would eventually marry her. When that didn't happen, she remained devoted anyway, serving as his confidant and, occasionally, accomplice. She helped him cover up the Neurovan side effects, Alexandra realized. She knew about my parents. Hansen nodded. She was protecting Richard, even after his death. By creating the sibling narrative, she accomplished two things. She prevented your marriage, which she likely saw as a betrayal of Richard's memory, and she diverted attention from Richard's most heinous crime, the murder of the Pierces, to a more sensational story of accidental incest. She was willing to psychologically torture us to protect his reputation, Jake asked incredulously. People in long-term, unrequited relationships can develop extreme loyalty, Hansen explained. In her mind, she was honoring his memory by preventing his son from marrying the daughter of his greatest enemy. Alexandra stood abruptly, pacing the conference room. All this time, these past 6 months, believing that Jake and she couldn't finish the sentence. Jake remained seated, his expression unreadable. Does Mary understand that her deception has been uncovered? Yes. She's been remarkably calm about it. Her only comment was, and I quote, "I did what Richard would have wanted." After Hansen and Dr. Winters left, Jake and Alexandra remained in the conference room, a heavy silence between them. "So we're not siblings," Alexandra finally said. "No. And everything else. My parents' murder, the Neurovan cover-up, was true." "Yes." Jake met her gaze directly. "Your revenge was justified. My father was a monster." Alexandra felt no satisfaction at this acknowledgement, only exhaustion. "Where does this leave us?" "I don't know," Jake admitted. "You infiltrated my life under false pretenses. You planned to use me to destroy my father." "Yes, but somewhere along the way your feelings became real." Alexandra hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but it doesn't erase what I did." Jake stood, moving to the window. "I've spent 6 months rebuilding Sullivan Pharmaceuticals from the ground up. Transparent testing protocols, patient advocacy committees, price reductions on critical medications. I'm trying to create something good from my father's corruption. I know, I've followed the news." He turned to face her. "And you? What have you been doing? Giving statements to prosecutors, rebuilding Pierce Pharmaceuticals with what assets remained in trust, trying to make sense of everything." The silence that fell between them was heavy with unspoken words, possibilities, and lingering hurt. "We're not siblings," Jake said finally, "but I don't know if we can ever move past everything else." Alexandra nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "I understand." As she gathered her coat to leave, Jake asked one final question. "Was any of it real? Us?" Alexandra paused at the door. "It became the most real thing in my life," she answered quietly. "And that's why the deception hurts us both." She left without looking back, snow beginning to fall more heavily outside. The truth had finally emerged from beneath layers of lies, but whether it could heal what had been broken remained uncertain. 1 year after the wedding that never was, the Pierce Sullivan Foundation for Reconstructive Surgery opened its doors in a renovated brownstone in Manhattan. The building stood as a physical manifestation of an unlikely partnership, a collaboration between two pharmaceutical empires once locked in deadly competition. Alexandra Pierce surveyed the reception area with quiet satisfaction. Photos of smiling patients lined the walls, each face bearing the marks of surgical reconstruction. Some showed children born with cleft palates, others adults rebuilding their lives after accidents. All represented second chances. "Miss Pierce, the board members are assembling in the conference room," her assistant informed her. Alexandra nodded, smoothing her tailored blazer. At 29, she had finally reclaimed not just her name but her purpose. The foundation represented the best parts of her parents' legacy, their commitment to healing rather than profit. The quarterly board meeting proceeded efficiently, with updates on patients served, surgical innovations, and funding allocations. As Alexandra concluded her presentation, she didn't miss the empty chair at the far end of the table, the seat reserved for Jake Sullivan. who had co-founded the foundation, but delegated his voting rights to a representative. In the year since learning they weren't siblings, Alexandra and Jake had maintained a strictly professional relationship, communicating primarily through intermediaries. Their joint foundation served as both penance and purpose, Jake's way of making amends for his father's crimes, Alexandra's way of honoring her parents' memory. After the meeting, Alexandra retreated to her office, where a framed photograph of her parents stood on her desk, the only personal item in an otherwise minimalist space. She touched the frame gently, a ritual that had become almost unconscious. "They would be proud," a voice said from the doorway. Alexandra looked up, startled to see Jake standing there. In the year since they'd last spoken directly, he'd changed, his face leaner, his eyes carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "I didn't know you were coming today," she said, regaining her composure. "I wanted to see the foundation in operation," he replied, remaining at the threshold. "May I come in?" Alexandra gestured to a chair, hyper-aware of his presence as he entered her space. The last time they'd been alone together had been in that lawyer's office, processing the truth about Mary's deception. "The foundation is exceeding expectations," she said, falling back on professional formality. "We've helped 63 patients in our first quarter alone." Jake nodded, his gaze taking in the office before settling on her. "That's not why I'm here." Alexandra tensed. "Then why?" "I'm leaving for Europe next week, expanding Sullivan Pharmaceuticals' ethical research division in Switzerland." "Congratulations," she said automatically. Ignoring the unexpected pang his announcement caused, Jake leaned forward slightly. "Before I go, I needed to give you something." From his briefcase, he withdrew a flat, square package wrapped in simple brown paper. Alexandra accepted it cautiously, unwrapping it to reveal a glass shadow box. Inside, carefully preserved, was a wedding veil. Her wedding veil. "I don't understand," she said, staring at the artifact from that catastrophic day. "You told me once it belonged to your mother," Jake explained quietly, "that it was the only thing that survived the crash with you. I thought you should have it back." Alexandra ran her fingers over the glass, memories flooding back. "Where did you get this?" "I left it at the church that day. Mary had taken it. It was among her possessions when the police searched her apartment." Jake hesitated. "I've been holding on to it for months, trying to decide what to do with it." The veil lay between them, a physical embodiment of everything that had gone wrong, and perhaps of what might have been genuine between them. "Why now?" Alexandra asked. Jake met her gaze directly. "Because I've spent a year trying to hate you for what you did. For the lies, the manipulation, the revenge plot that used me as a pawn." He shook his head slightly. "But the truth is, despite everything, I've never been able to regret knowing you." Alexandra felt something crack in the carefully constructed wall she'd built around her emotions. "Jake, let me finish," he said gently. "What you did was wrong. The deception was wrong. But your cause wasn't. My father was responsible for your parents' deaths. He covered up Neurovan side effects, causing countless more deaths. Your anger was justified." "That doesn't excuse how I went about it," Alexandra replied. "No, it doesn't. But this past year has taught me something about holding on to anger." Jake gestured to the foundation around them. "Look what we've built from the wreckage of our family's warfare. Something healing, something good." Alexandra studied him, trying to understand where this was leading. "Are you saying you forgive me?" "I'm saying I understand you," Jake corrected. "And I'm saying that despite everything, the woman I got to know during those 8 months, whoever she was, Natalie or Alexandra or some combination of both, that woman was real to me." Alexandra felt tears threatening. "Parts of her were real," she admitted. "More than I wanted to acknowledge at the time. Natalie Brooks was created as a disguise, but somewhere along the way, she became a part of me." Jake nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "That's the woman I fell in love with, not the revenge-driven Alexandra, not the completely fabricated Natalie, but the person who emerged in between, the one who helped students find meaning in literature, who saw beyond the Sullivan name to the person I was trying to become." "What are you saying, Jake?" He stood, moving toward the door. "I'm saying that before I leave for Europe, I wanted you to know that I've made peace with our past, that despite everything, I'm grateful our paths crossed, even under false pretenses." Alexandra rose as well, the shadow box still in her hands. Is this goodbye then? Jake hesitated at the threshold. That depends on you. My flight leaves next Saturday. If you want to talk, really talk, about who we are now and what might be possible, I'll be at the Bethesda Fountain in Central Park at noon that day, and if I don't come, then I'll know your answer, and I'll wish you well with the foundation in your life. After he left, Alexandra sat for a long time, staring at the veiled shadow box. The thin fabric had once concealed her identity, her scars both real and imagined. Now it represented a choice, to remain behind the protective barriers she'd constructed, or to step beyond them into uncertainty. Saturday arrived crisp and clear, autumn painting Central Park in fiery hues of red and gold. Alexandra stood at the edge of the park, her mother's veil in her hands, removed from the shadow box, delicate and fragile in the open air. At the Bethesda Fountain, Jake checked his watch for the third time. 12:15. He scanned the winding paths, seeing tourists, joggers, families, but not Alexandra. He'd known it was a long shot, perhaps an impossible one. Some bridges once burned couldn't be rebuilt. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A woman approaching from the mall, carrying what appeared to be a wedding veil. Alexandra. She stopped before him, neither speaking for a moment. I almost didn't come, she finally admitted. What changed your mind? Alexandra unfolded the veil carefully. I realized something about this veil. My mother wore it on her wedding day not to hide, but to mark a transition. From one phase of life to another. I've been hiding long enough. She handed the veil to Jake. I don't know if we can build something new from the ashes of everything that happened, but I'd like to try. Without disguises, without veils, just Alexandra and Jake, seeing each other clearly for the first time. Jake took the veil, then gently set it on the fountain's edge. No more masks. No more masks, she agreed. As they walked together through the autumn-painted park, the veil caught a gust of wind, lifting momentarily before settling back on the stone, a gossamer reminder of the past they were finally leaving behind. In the foundation office, the framed veil would eventually take its place on the wall, not as a symbol of deception or revenge, but as a reminder that even from the deepest tragedies, something meaningful could emerge when the veils between people finally fell away.